Okay, so we can open the floor to discussion. Any questions? We've had a few thoughts.
I would like to make a comment. I was listening carefully. Wonderful presentations. But when you are in your working groups tomorrow, I would like very much to give a thought, at least, if not really to consider writing about it in your project. All the sexual abuse that was done, and we are not talking about it, by Jews, starting in the ghettos, when a working certificate many times meant sexual relationships, and then going into the concentration camps, as we can see in some of the testimonies in Carol Rittner's book, that sexual abuse was done by Jews. And I think that, I know, it's not that I think, I know that it's easier to talk about the Germans and the Soviet soldiers, but still I think that we should be honest and give space to this issue. And I remember when I was starting to writing about women in the Holocaust, the first thing that my mommy said to me, and she was a Holocaust survivor, was please let our generation to pass away peacefully and only then start talking about it. But I think that it's our duty and responsibility nowadays to study and teach the issue of Jews taking advantage of their fellow Jews in the ghettos and camps, and also for in other places of hiding or in the kinder transport. We know that some of the children arrived to Jewish families and they were abused there. And I think that we should pay attention to it.
Thank you, Lily. It's such an important question you raise. It's something that has fascinated me for many years, not only about the sexual abuse by Jews, which I came across a few times and which people object to hearing about, but inappropriate or unethical behavior by Jews in many aspects of the Holocaust is something we don't talk about. And I do recall reading, and I forget the name of who wrote it, immediately after the Holocaust, there were some writings about the inappropriate behavior, the looting of other rooms, or the abuse by Jewish people of other Jews in the ghettos. And it was published first in a different language, in French or something else. I forget the details now. But when it was translated into Hebrew a few months later and published in Israel, those details were omitted and were never republished again. Right. And it's a part, excuse me if I forget the names and the details now, but it's something that stayed with me in my readings, that this was an aspect of the Holocaust we don't talk about, and you raise it now again. The Jewish people who were also abusers and perpetrators of unethical, inappropriate, and on occasion sexual abuse is something we don't mention. And we need to think about how far we want to go down this line and how important it is for us to talk about it. The other aspect of this is the trials that were held in Israel shortly afterwards, right, about those who were reported Jewish inappropriate behavior. And those trials were the Capo trials. They were embargoed till 70 years or so after the war, because we couldn't face the horror of Jews committing atrocities as well. And it is something that maybe it's time to relook at all this. Okay, sorry, I talked too much. Anyone else who would like to add to this discussion now?
You have two hands raised, Andrea and
Anna and Katarzyna.
Anna?
Hi. Yeah, so following this fascinating discussion and all the talks which we are done now, I was thinking also like in this direction, actually like about the education, how we are going to proceed with it, because it's an extremely important, and I would say maybe because this topic is extremely sensitive, like you mentioned, like, you know, also because of the dignity, like of people who say, like, you know, went through it, and because it's so complicated, maybe, I mean, we would think about give some introductions from psychologists, like, you know, professional people who can give some introductions to the whole story about like the whole issue, to avoid all the things like blamings and like, you know, into one or other side, or like, you know, all this unnecessary discussions, just, you know, to make the area very, very clear and neutral during these discussions. Because I think this, especially these fields of research, really desperately needs also some psychological approach, like, you know, when we are discussing it, also especially in the education, because without these tools, we are just, we'll go into really deep trouble, like, you know, with, especially with, like, you know, younger generation.
Yes, thank you. Katerina, would you
Thank you
like?
very much. Yes, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. My question is to the second presentation. You said that there was a certain over-representation of the results of the experiments in the files asking for compensation, and I was wondering if this was like a misuse of this effect, or perhaps actually following this this thought of psychological interpretations. Maybe this was just there were no available interpretation that would express the actual effect of the experiment on the woman who applied for compensation. As you showed us, it was not true that her partners left her because she didn't have children. That's was the result of the experiments she went through. But perhaps the fact that she went through the Shoah, especially this abuse and experimentation, led her to enter a relationship with abusive partner, and that's another direction to look at. So it's not about I would say like saying perhaps that it's not true that there were like so big results of this experimentation.
This sound is very difficult with you. I'm sorry, Katerina. I think we heard much of what you said, but perhaps not all.
Right.
Maybe I can move on to, is it Yefat? That's the name that shows up on the screen. Do you want to add a comment? Yefat, I'm not hearing anything.
Yes. Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a question and wondering thing. Is there any interdiscussion among few women together, testimonies about this abuse? And the second question, is there any research about the pregnancy that came from this abuse and rapes? The children that came from those pregnancies. Thank you very much.
Perhaps I can answer a little on that. There is quite a lot written, especially about the rape of women at liberation. Diana, maybe you can add more to this. The rate of abortion following that experience at the end of the war went through the roof. Abortions were not allowed until then under the Nazi era, at least for non-Jewish women. But because of the rapes, there was an absolute epidemic of abortions that were carried out to terminate those pregnancies. I don't know about the pregnancies from other times in terms of the follow-up for that. And that's a fascinating question. Anyone else want to add? Or should we move to
Andrea wants to
no,
say
there's
something.
Alessandro and Andrea both have names up. So Andrea spoke a little earlier. Maybe we go to Alessandro first, then I'll come to you, Andrea, okay?
Yes, any question for Boris Klaxman? You cited in your intervention Dr. Klauberg, if I don't make an error. If you made the research also about documents on the trials against Klauberg, because it is connected with the cousin of one Jewish Sardinian woman that probably were victim of Klauberg experimentations. It was Laura Geiringer from Venezia. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. So it was actually Karl Gebhardt that I was talking about. And no, because my dissertation was about the restitution and compensation of survivors. So I chiefly investigated only the compensation files. And of course, if I could find additional sources about the people who gave these testimonies, of course, I used those. But I didn't do research on the perpetrators themselves.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 more questions from Andrea and Olga. Andrea, if you would like to.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this fantastically interesting panel. Again, the question is, how can we use this in teaching? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the medicalization is really not a solution, but maybe connecting it to present military conflicts and present wars, and thinking about, using these kind of testimonies as a possible tool to understand and to compare experiences. And I think here we actually encountered one of the major theoretical problems, because in one of the presentations we heard Patrick Dubois' statement saying that there is nothing special in the Holocaust because everything is the same. Violence is violence, right? And then there is, of course, the other position, which is saying that there is a specificity here. So I would, in my 1-minute intervention, I don't think I can solve this. I just would like to flag this, as this might come back in the classrooms. Right. Yes. So this is one of those issues which need to be considered as one of the issues to be handled in the classrooms. And just another point about the capos and the capo trials. I think that the fact that this has been tabooized and really, somehow silenced has actually has got a major impact now in this illiberal turn, because now they are several illiberal historians are using the fact that this hasn't been discussed as a discovery, and they are showing up as those who are making this visible, unlike the others who wanted to hide this. And it of course opens the Pandora box for very different, very inconvenient, and sometimes very unethical discussions. So I just wanted to flag this, that the more the tabooization is happening, later the more problems we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are important concepts. Yes. Olga, last question, I think, on our group.
Okay. Do you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually had 2 questions, one for Bori, because her presentation focuses on the reparations and especially focusing on the 1956. From what I understood, I was a bit, I wasn't able to focus because I was on the tram. So as far as I heard, it was the point of departure for her study was the 1956 reparations. Now, I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that particular year, and the relationship between Hungary and Western Germany, and how that played a role in the type of compensations that were actually offered. Because, for example, there were other Eastern European countries that were not considered by the 1956 Wiedergutmachung laws as eligible, being in the communist socialist lager, as they say, the socialist sphere. So if you can speak a little bit about that and how that particular relationship between those 2 states functioned in the possibility of making the reparations accessible. That's one. And should I say my other question now, or should I wait for the answer? What is better?
We're a little bit short of time, but perhaps let Bori answer you first, and then we'll see.
Yeah, I could talk a lot about this, but I will be just very brief. Yeah, so actually, Hungary was also excluded in the Wiedergutmachung laws. But from 1957, the Hungarian government started to put pressure on West Germany to give at least the right to Hungarian survivors to get compensation. And actually this program that I was talking about, which was for the victims of medical experiment, this was also extended to other East European countries, as far as I know, so not only to Hungary. And the organization I was talking about, this National Committee of Persons Persecuted by Nazism, they were especially established for this purpose in 1957, and they were putting this pressure and making all these diplomatic efforts to get the compensation from West Germany. So this was basically a diplomatic success for Hungary, and basically we were one of the first countries in Eastern Europe to get compensation for the survivors.
Thank you. Olga, we have just 2 minutes left. Is your question a very quick one, or?
Yes, basically it's what I wrote in the chat, and it's just kind of from personal experience in my own family. My grandmother was a survivor of the Yash pogrom, and she spoke about the enormous sympathy that people in Yash, like her, basically Jews who were survivors, had for the Russian liberators, with the caveat that they also recognized that there were some Russian liberators who indeed took advantage of their position of power to rape and to do things that were not considered ethical, while there were others that indeed tried very hard to put a stop to this quote unquote chaos and abuse. So she looks at it as an individual kind of phenomenon. And I was also wondering within that, what would be the statistics? Do we have an overview on a comparative analysis between how much the Russian soldiers abused their position of liberators in power versus other Allied soldiers? There's been a study done, for example, about the level of abuse and rape among other Allied soldiers, meaning Americans primarily, and then French and English and others. And then the Russian liberators. But I would be very interested in understanding an overall and a holistic view of how the liberators took advantage of their positions to abuse the victims.
Thank you very much. That's such a huge question. And we have very little information, I think, overall to give us accurate statistics for all the many difficult challenges that Andrea raised earlier, as well as Nama. Perhaps these will come out over the discussions. Thank you. Unless anyone would like to answer.
If I could just say a quick word to respond to part of Olga's question. So can you hear me?
Yep. Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry. So yes, it's a big question, but just to respond to the first part of the question that you asked, at least, this is a very good one. The question on kind of who helped and who harmed. And something that appears in the testimonies, and it's very hard to say if this can be generalized because, the number of testimonies on this is, of course, limited for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that appears in the testimonies that I've looked at is that a number of the women survivors suggest that they specifically refer to Jewish soldiers or officers who helped, right? That they were in a bad situation and someone helped them out. And this is true whether we're talking about liberation or whether we're talking about another topic that I write on, which is women in Soviet filtration camps. This is something that appears fairly often, but again, it's hard to say how generalizable this is. I mean, when there's a reference to violence, it tends to be the term, they use the word Russian. They don't tend to use Soviet. People say Russian soldiers, but when they refer to those who helped, they tend to say it was a Jewish soldier, it was a Jewish officer. And sometimes they say, well, his comrades didn't know that he was Jewish. So sometimes maybe that was hidden or it wasn't hidden, but there was some way of communicating that. It doesn't always come out in detail, but that's something that appears. And again, whether or not that sort of is fully generalizable is difficult to say, but that's something that I've noticed in the testemonies, just with regard to the question you asked. So I think we've probably used up our last seconds.
All our time, yes, thank you. Many of us were on a talk yesterday given through the Ghetto Fighters House Museum on the Yash pogrom. And there again was another example of how local non-Jewish people helped. And this was a miracle of, regarded as a miracle of survival, because somebody was kind enough to help them, and that's how they survived. And you keep coming across these kinds of stories, but the idea of statistics that give us a good indication of how much, how often this happened and with whom is a far more challenging answer to come to. Thank you, everybody, for this talk. We will meet again over days.